The first lie she told was with her smile. It looked effortless, clean, practiced, polished enough for a promo video. But I've interrogated foreign asset runners under fake hotel walls in Prague, and I've seen the same smile right before the knife came out. The room smelled like citrus toner and synthetic leather. She tapped her phone twice with the kind of passive-aggressive rhythm reserved for airport lounges and execution orders. Then she slid the envelope across the boardroom table with 2 fingers, like it was just another memo. "You're too set in your ways," she said, eyes still on her screen. "We need younger energy. Faster decisions." I didn't flinch, just studied the grain in the conference table. Oak laminate, 5 years old, tiny scorch mark near the head chair, from when the founder used to smoke cigars in the early days. He built this company with unshakable paranoia. Probably the only thing I respected about him. My name is Dorian Nash. I'm 49 years old. On paper, I was Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions at Graybridge Dynamics, a multinational tech infrastructure firm with contracts in 26 countries and silent influence in twice that many. My role came with a 7-figure salary, an armored car service, and enough NDAS to bury a small nation. But the truth is simpler. I was placed here by the Department of Economic Containment and Counter-Subversion, ECCS for short. Quiet branch, black budget. Our job is to track financial terrorism, foreign laundering disguised as mergers, enemy states hiding inside shell companies, power shifting hands under the illusion of market forces. I wasn't promoted. I was embedded. 6 years deep, 3 layers of identity, no room for mistakes. And now she was trying to erase me with a signature and a smile. The paper had all the right buzzwords: organizational agility, evolving leadership profile, cultural realignment. Beneath the surface, though, it was just one thing: an extraction. Someone got spooked. Someone pushed the panic button. The irony. I wasn't even finished with my investigation. But this move, this little power play dressed up as an HR event, told me everything I needed to know. I slid the termination letter into my briefcase, closed the clasps, stood up. She didn't even look up from her phone. Just said, "We'll send you your severance proposal next week." Oh, and it's already started revoking access. Hope that's not an issue. It wasn't. I gave her a smile of my own. Not charming, not angry, just a slow, hollow arc that says, "You already lost and don't know it yet." Then I walked out. No raised voice, no dramatic pause at the door, just footsteps and silence. The elevator ride down felt like it lasted hours. My badge blinked red when I tried to swipe it at the exit. Predictable. The guard, new, young, overeager, offered a sheepish apology and buzzed me out manually. He'll learn, or he won't. By the time I reached my car, the game had already shifted. The company phone went dark, email login blocked, cloud credentials wiped. But I didn't need their network. I had mine. I drove 27 miles north, past the commuter zone, through the tree line outside city jurisdiction, pulled into a gravel driveway camouflaged under a decommissioned shipping registry. The cabin looked abandoned by design: warped deck, peeling paint, half a satellite dish nailed sideways to the roof. But beneath it was something else. A hatch. Biometric locked, thermal shielded, zero cellular bleed. My sanctuary. I called it the tomb, not because I was hiding, but because this is where secrets go to be exhumed. I powered up the system. 4 custom-built drives, each encrypted with decentralized blockchain keys, each with fragments of what I'd been collecting for 6 years. Contracts, IP transfers, unregistered wire routes, offshore holdings masked through a fake philanthropic foundation based in Liechtenstein. And recently, something worse. The last access log tied to her account wasn't a quarterly report. It was a series of transfer authorizations, masked IP. Time-stamped 3 hours after her uncle, the founder, suffered a suspicious cerebral event. I leaned back, eyes on the screen, as lines of raw metadata scrolled past. This wasn't mismanagement. It was erasure. And now that I was out of the way, she thought she could clean house, burn the trail, rewrite the narrative. The smiling niece-turned CEO. The old strategist, too slow for modern markets. She thought she'd buried me. She didn't realize I was the one holding the shovel. 79%. That was my closing rate for Tier 1 contracts at Graybridge Dynamics. Not marketing fluff, not internal spin, real numbers, verified through board audits and third-party compliance firms. 79% of the clients on our top revenue tier came through my hands. Not because I smiled pretty or threw steakhouse dinners, but because I spoke the language behind the language. Fear, ambition, leverage. I could smell it before the first handshake. Countries with collapsing currencies, oil barons with public image crises, defense contractors looking to whitewash deals. They came to Graybridge because they knew I could make their rot look like gold. You don't negotiate with countries unless you know what they're hiding. You don't stabilize volatile accounts unless you understand how to make volatility your tool. I once closed a deal with a Brazilian mineral conglomerate over a single phrase I whispered in their CFO's ear. I told him I knew about the offshore mine in Pará, and more importantly, that I didn't care, as long as he moved his digital infrastructure through us. 2 weeks later, they signed a 10-year contract. Another time, I cooled off a sovereign proxy in Dubai by forging a 10-minute friendship with their translator. He thought I'd picked up the dialect on deployment. I hadn't. I just listened better than the last 5 guys they sent. None of that mattered now. The new interim CEO, founder's niece, fresh out of some boutique consulting firm that confused PowerPoint speed with decision-making, decided I was too slow, too methodical. She didn't want analysis. She wanted blind acceleration. She didn't want questions. She wanted obedience. But I hadn't been placed at Graybridge to obey. I was here to monitor. And I'd seen enough red flags in the last 6 months to justify a full ECCS probe. The real problem wasn't inefficiency. It was her. 4 months before my termination, she tried to authorize a $94 million transfer to an entity called Balsantier Holdings, Cayman registered. No employees, no paper trail. The transaction ID was masked under Legacy Tech Acquisition, and the signature was time-stamped for 2:43 a.m. I flagged it, froze the route, told legal to hold the paperwork until verified through compliance. That afternoon, she called me into her office. She smiled the entire time, said it was a misunderstanding, that the entity was part of a restructuring initiative, that I shouldn't get bogged down in the weeds. I told her my job was the weeds. What I didn't tell her was that the system I used to flag the transfer had recorded everything: audio, screen capture, metadata, embedded protocols. I wrote them myself 3 years ago, buried so deep in the server that even our internal CTO couldn't detect them without a map he didn't know existed. That night, after I froze the $94 million, she made a call. I tracked it 3 days ago, once I was safely out and off-grid. The internal surveillance trigger, still alive and whispering from a forgotten mirror server, picked up the signal. It was routed through a soft IP bounce in Estonia, masked through a Canadian VPN, and finally terminated in a warehouse in Jersey City listed as Cold Tech Imports. But I'd seen the IP pattern before. It belonged to a ghost network ECCS, had flagged 2 years ago, used by a transnational sabotage ring to quietly transfer economic power through friendly corporate shells. This wasn't just embezzlement. It was systemic sabotage. Graybridge wasn't the target. It was the weapon. And I was the block in the barrel she needed to remove. She didn't know I'd left the system alive. She thought wiping my credentials severed the connection. But I never used company logins to access the real core. I had my own keys, my own access points, my own ears. Now, in my underground sanctuary, the screen glowed soft blue. The file was queued, decrypted, waiting. The file name was clinical, like most betrayals, 10-4-23-CEO_room.m4a. I tapped the key. The audio crackled, then settled. A voice, hers, low, steady, falsely calm. Tomorrow, dump the rest. He'll be out of the way by then. The boardroom smelled different that day. Not the usual polished mahogany and espresso notes. Something sharper. Sweat, maybe. Panic has a scent, and it always gets in first, even before the facts do. They called the emergency session under the pretext of routine audit escalation. But no one believed that. You don't summon every major stakeholder, fly in 2 legal observers, and secure the doors unless someone just pulled a pin. They had. It started with an anomaly, just a line item buried in a quarterly cash flow report, a missing signature, a transaction that existed on the balance sheet but didn't exist in the contract archive. $94 million had evaporated into a Cayman hole with no legal backing, no executive approval, no attached vendor ID, just a ghost trail leading to a nowhere fund. She tried to get ahead of it, walked in early, hair tied back tight, all white blazer, like she was there to bless a charity gala. She smiled too much, laughed too easily. When the CFO asked about the transaction, she blamed me. Said the system had been slow since the legacy guy ran it. Said I must have been cleaning out my own corner on the way out. He always had access, she offered, shrugging just enough to look reluctant. What she didn't know was that the audit software she leaned on. I wrote it. Every subroutine, every trigger, every buried failsafe. It didn't just track transactions. It listened for patterns, for distortions in protocol, for contradictions between metadata and behavior, and it had just gone hot. Failsafe 1 was designed to activate when high-level inconsistencies hit 3 or more nodes. That had happened 2 days ago. Right now, in that very room, the board was sitting on top of a live feed I controlled. They didn't know it, but their entire internal comms hub was being mirrored. Audio, video, biometric spikes. And the painting on the far wall? The one they never moved because it was a gift from the founder? A custom oil reproduction I had commissioned and installed 2 years ago. In the center was a micro-aperture lens, wirelessly feeding encrypted video back to my secure node. She had no idea. I watched her posture shift when the legal director slid the report forward. Her smile faltered. Not much, but enough. She reached for the pen, but her hand paused halfway. The air stiffened. Someone coughed. Then the chairman, a man who rarely spoke unless numbers were involved, looked her in the eye and asked, "Why was the authorization time-stamped when you were in Seattle?" She blinked. That was the moment she realized something was off script. I could almost hear her recalculating. Delegate. A lot of the automation is templated, she said quickly. The platform sometimes preloads times based on drafts. It was finalized. The chairman cut in. Executed. No draft log. No flag from compliance. She tried to pivot. Blamed legal. Blamed the old architecture. Blamed me again. He had root access to the legacy systems. He could have faked the timestamp. That's when I dropped the first payload. A redacted report, brief, dense, and designed to explode slowly, landed in every board member's inbox at the same time. Subject line: Restricted Audit Addendum, Tier 3 Transfer Networks. Inside were traces of financial links between Balsan Tier Holdings and 3 known cartel laundering outfits. The names weren't spelled out, but the identifiers were unmistakable to anyone who'd ever read an international compliance brief. Tag markers, IP hops, even 2 partial phone call transcripts. Enough smoke to make them start choking. One board member, Patel, stood up halfway through reading. He didn't say a word, just gathered his notes, face pale, and walked out. I watched her eyes track him, watched her grip tighten on the chair arm. She didn't smile now. She didn't blink. She just sat frozen, the spotlight she lit now burning her alive. They were going to turn on her, not because they cared about integrity, but because they could smell the liability, blood in the water, PR nightmares, regulatory storms. No one wanted to be within 10 feet of this bomb when it went off. I told them once, back when they first asked for my help with vetting vendors, that clean hands make dirty liars nervous. Now I didn't have to tell them anything. The facility sat off the state highway like a forgotten thought, one of those places designed to look peaceful, but sterile underneath. Trimmed hedges, polite signage, neutral tones in the entryway, like color itself might be too much stimulation. I signed in under a false name. Didn't need anyone knowing I'd been there. The nurse at the front desk barely looked up, just buzzed me through the security door and pointed me down the hall. Room 113. End of the West Wing. Private. No roommate. Just 4 beige walls, and a window that overlooked a patch of lawn they called a garden. I stepped in quietly. The man in the chair turned his head as if he'd been expecting someone, but not her. He smiled. "Dorian," he said, voice cracked but clear. I nodded. "Still remember me?" "I remember the ones who didn't lie to my face," he said, then reached for the armrest with a tremor in his hand. "She doesn't visit." "I know." The founder of Greybridge Dynamics was once a force of nature. Gabriel Halverson built his empire like it was a counterintelligence campaign, compartmentalized, secure, ruthless where it counted. He didn't play favorites, didn't believe in family hires. That changed 5 years ago after the stroke. That's when they started whispering in his ear, feeding him optimism and legalese. When the papers were signed, transferring operational control to his niece, everyone said it was just temporary. Everyone lied. He looked older now, smaller, but not gone. The sharpness in his eyes was still there, just slower to arrive. I reached into my coat and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, a single Cuban cigar, the real kind, smuggled in through a diplomatic contact 2 months earlier. His eyes lit up like I'd handed him his youth. "You spoil me," he said. "You earned it." He tapped the cigar against his palm, but didn't light it, just held it like a relic. "She's worse than I imagined, isn't she?" I didn't answer, just powered on the tablet I brought with me and cued the audio file. No headlines, no context, just a cold start. "Tomorrow. Dump the rest. He'll be out of the way by then." He listened without blinking. The room was silent except for the distant shuffle of hallway slippers and the steady wheeze of the HVAC unit overhead. When it ended, I watched his eyes drop to the floor, not in grief, but in calculation. "I knew she had teeth," he said finally. "Didn't think she'd bite blood." She's not just dirty, I said. She's a liability. She's turned the company into a tunnel. Cartel? I nodded once. Not directly, but close enough to set off 3 interagency alarms. He exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing at something only he could see. Then he turned to the drawer beside his chair and pulled out a narrow leather folio. I didn't have to ask. I already knew what it contained. The clause, buried in a legal document signed 12 years ago, under a foundation trust no one even remembered existed, was an equity trigger, one that transferred back controlling interest to Gabriel in the event of proven breach of fiduciary duty. Not a vote, not a lawsuit, just automatic reversion. Silent, absolute. All it needed was evidence. I submitted the trigger through a secure channel that evening, attached the flagged audio, the Cayman transaction metadata, and the compliance report the board never knew they received. 3 hours later, the failsafe activated. All legal functions were sealed, pending review. No transfers, no votes, no withdrawals. She had 48 hours before it reached her inbox, and she still thought she'd won. He looked at me one last time before I left, holding the unlit cigar like a totem. Will they know it was you? They'll suspect, I said. But it won't matter. The trigger doesn't care who pulled it, just that it fired. As I walked down the corridor, past the forgotten residence and flowerless vases, I thought about the irony. She'd built her entire power grab on his legacy, wore his name like a badge, quoted him in press interviews, branded herself as his second coming. But legacy isn't blood. It's memory, preserved in the hands of those who knew where the bones were buried. She fired me thinking I was a threat to her career. She didn't realize I was the firewall. She stood behind the podium with the confidence of someone who still believed in her own myth. White suit, high ponytail, the same media smile that had graced Forbes under the headline, "The Next Titan of Tech." Cameras clicked, mics extended, the company logo glowing behind her like a seal of destiny. She called it a new era of agility and innovation, spoke in polished phrases about strategic restructuring and how change, while difficult, was necessary for growth. What she didn't know was that her clock had already run out. I watched from a lounge chair inside a private hangar 30 miles outside the city, one hand around a glass of mineral water, the other hovering over the screen of a tablet that controlled a sequence I'd spent weeks perfecting. She wanted faster decisions. This one would be instantaneous. At exactly 10:04 a.m., the first domino fell. Every offshore account linked to her digital signature across 8 jurisdictions, 5 dummy corporations, and 3 laundering fronts was dumped simultaneously into the inboxes of 42 financial journalists. Each file cross-verified with routing timestamps, disguised subledger balances, and the one thing even the best PR firm can't erase: the truth. By 10:06, the first journalist had already tweeted a link to the cache. By 10:07, Graybridge scandal was trending globally. The press conference faltered. A phone rang off stage, then another. Her comms director leaned in to whisper something into her ear, but she brushed him off. She had practiced this moment too many times in the mirror to let it unravel, but it was unraveling. At 10:08 a.m., the board received a secure file titled Nightingale Final. Inside were 3 things: the full audio from her call authorizing the dump, surveillance stills from the mirrored system she never found, and a detailed transaction log annotated by an independent forensic team I hired under a pseudonym. It wasn't just damning. It was surgical, precise enough to remove deniability, cold enough to erase sympathy. At 10:10, her badge failed. It happened live, on camera, as she tried to re-enter the building during a staged walkthrough for media. She tapped once, red, tried again, red, a third time. Security flanked her within seconds. The microphones caught her tone shift. "There's been a mistake," she said, still smiling. "I need to get back inside." The guards didn't move. By 10:11, the comms director had walked off stage. The camera feed was cut. The broadcast ended mid-sentence. I watched it all from the tarmac. The engines of the Gulfstream G600 behind me spun soft and steady, waiting. I wasn't escaping, just repositioning. The kind of move ghosts make when the mission's done and the noise begins. The tablet buzzed once, facial recognition complete. She was being escorted from the premises, wrists tight in stainless steel. The board had moved fast after the drop. I knew they would. Their survival depended on it. She struggled, protested, claimed breach, setup, entrapment. But her voice lacked conviction. Somewhere beneath the defiance, the reality was settling in. There were no backup plans, no leverage left. I smiled. The wind outside picked up, rustling the edges of the hangar doors. I remembered something she once said to me, over cocktails at a fundraiser before everything curdled. "I always win," she whispered that night. "You just don't know the rules yet." I looked at the screen one last time. Her face was contorted now, eyes wide, teeth clenched, the smile gone. Just skin and panic. "You were right," I said softly. "I didn't know the rules." I tapped the final button. So I rewrote them. The plane lifted off smooth and quiet, slicing into the pale sky without ceremony. Below me, Graybridge was on fire, not in flames, but in headlines, lawsuits and whispers behind every closed boardroom door from Zurich to Singapore. There would be resignations, testimonies, quiet settlements, maybe even a reshuffling of the name. But her story was over. There will be no comeback, no retrial, no epilogue. The system that made her just swallowed her whole. I didn't need to bury her. I just had to let the rot surface.